If you were in class on Wednesday, April 6th, then you already heard me talking for about 20 minutes about point of view. And if you weren't, you are who I made this video for, although it possibly might be useful to people who were in class anyway. So these are the notes that I was speaking from on the 6th in class. And a handful of terms that I want you guys to be able to use, or at least to recognize, regarding narrative point of view. Omniscient, limited, objective, or dramatized, which means more or less the same thing. And there are also these other couple of things that people frequently say that also mean the same thing, that objective narration is like fly on the wall narration or Hemingway-esque narration. And since I started talking about it already, I'll just go ahead and say one more thing about that. This style of narration is the one where we don't get inside anybody's head, basically. The only information that we have about a scene with characters in it doing things or feeling things is what could be seen from outside those people's heads. Like if you were just there eavesdropping, or if you had planted a camera and a tape recorder on the scene, this is the information you would get. You would not get any information about people's inner life, their thoughts and feelings in any one of these, which is all basically the same thing, type of narrations. So this is the type where we have access to zero minds, okay? Now, a limited narration is one where we have access to exactly one mind. Sometimes limited narration is called limited omniscient, a term I do not like, but you sort of have to be able to realize that if you see this limited omniscient, they mean the same thing as what I mean by limited, basically. And then so-called omniscient point of view, where we have access to more than one mind. Again, I don't love this term, but it is a term very commonly used. Okay, so these are the basic breakdowns of narrators that give us possibly multiple access to different minds versus just one mind versus zero minds, and everything we know about how people are thinking and feeling, we know on the basis of inferences that we make. Like, well, this is how I would feel if I was in the situation, or this is how I would feel if I said that, kind of thing. Okay, so these are terms that are in very common use for talking about basic different types of narrative point of view strategy. People frequently also talk about first person point of view and third person point of view. Again, terminology I do not love, but which is used often. And you do have to kind of notice there are some differences between somebody who's telling their own story in their own words, and therefore they're using the word I. This happened to me over and over again, right? First person because it's a first person pronoun. Versus stories in which it is not a person telling their very own story. And so you won't see I and me used, except inside of dialogue, of course. People are still free in dialogue to talk about themselves. The reason I don't love this to be a person's go-to, when I say describe the narrative point of view, and a student comes back with, well, it's first person, or well, it's third person. Yes, that is something you need to notice, and it's not insignificant, but it shouldn't be your first go-to thing for divvying up the possibility space. This is not the best way to categorize what point of views are, because there are so many different kinds of third person narration. There's actually even more than one kind of first person narration too, but there are types of third person narration that have more in common with a first person narration than they have with a more omniscient style of third person narration. And a third person limited point of view, or what's sometimes called a close third person narration, where it's just like you inhabit one person's experience in the story, but they're not telling you it themselves, but still that is the person we are following through the story and the person we are most identifying with. That type of third person has way more in common with the first person narration than it has with a third person omniscient. Okay, so much for those terms. Now, the thing that you need to know more than you need anything else at this moment, because I put it on the quiz, is this term, focal character or focalization. These terms here have been around for a long time, a century in some cases, and they're not really highly technical terms. They're not, at least sort of hardcore, I am on the cutting edge of research in narratology kind of terminology. And focal isn't either. Focal is kind of mainstream at this point, but it hasn't been in use for more than half a century, unlike some of these other terms. Focal character and the idea of focalization was invented by this guy, Gerard Genette, in a book that he published in 1972 called Narrative Discourse. So this was a key advance in the field, because before that, but I haven't put these terms on the list, narrator and protagonist, because we covered them already in a previous video. Gerard Genette added to those concepts, narrator and protagonist, the new concept of focal character. And like the second he did it, everybody realized that, oh yeah, we needed that term all along. And to provide a little intuitive support to this idea of what a focal character is, Gerard Genette posed these two questions: who sees and who says? Okay, well, the narrator is the person who says. If there is a stream of words coming at you from a particular voice saying, this is what happened to me in the first person, or this is what happened to him in the third person, that's a narrator. Incidentally, Genette was only talking about, well, he wasn't talking about comics, basically. He was talking about what I call prose literature, meaning it's only made out of words. Words is all the equipment that the author has to work with. So Genette's terms, and that these terms were invented for those situations too. They applied to literature rather than to comics. Okay, so who says is the narrator, who is the source of the words. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the person whose mental experience we are sharing. So the idea of who sees is like, where do we project our own consciousness? Like we are looking through that character's eyes. And quite frequently, both of these things are necessary. The narrator is providing some part of our empathetic experience of another person, possibly fictional, right? And then the focal character is contributing something else. Okay, let me give you an example. This is a book called Jimmy Corrigan, The Smartest Boy on Earth. Oops, sorry, The Smartest Kid on Earth by Chris Ware, same dude who wrote Building Stories. It's an amazingly complex and beautiful book. Here on page 137, there's two main protagonists in this book. And here's one of them. His name is James Corrigan. And he lives, this scene is from like the 1890s. And the other main character is his grandson, who we see in the 1980s. So it's a complicated, multi-generational story. Anyway, here we are in the 1890s, and the little boy is being shown this like slideshow by his father, who is on a hot date with this woman. The brightly colored shadows fail to capture the boy's interest. Okay, That's the voice of a narrator and a third person narrator, because it's not the little boy himself saying, the slideshow failed to capture my interest. On the next page, the narrator again tells us the boy begins to imagine. A little light from the lamp flame, blah, blah, blah. And here he is in his own imagination, floating through the air and pointing the beam out the window. This is not a picture of what's really happening. This is what's going on inside the little boy's imagination, inside his head. So this is conveyed to us by two things at once, right? The narrator's voice narrating the experience, and this like direct projection of us into this is his subjective experience. So this is a blended point of view where the narrator is contributing something, and this kid, the focal character, is contributing something too. So this is a focal character right here. On a subsequent page, and we still have the same narrator, but on this page, we're getting a little bit inside the little boy's father's head. His name is William Corrigan. He's got an ongoing sexual relationship with this woman as soon as they put the kid to bed, right? And he's thinking about it, about how she probably wants to marry him. And the way he thinks about that is that the putting of a wedding ring on the finger is like sticking your head into a noose. So once again, this is not like objective reality. This is a person's perspective. And it's the narrator, you could call this an omniscient third person type narrator, because it takes us into the heads of more than one different character. But it's not the opinion of the narrator that getting married is just like sticking your head in a noose. It's his opinion. So that this idea or this emotion, or call it what you want, the like recoiling from the idea of marriage, that's coming through him. All right, that is subjective rather than objective information. And the narrator doesn't particularly endorse it, although there's a kind of a blending of the narrator's neutral voice with Mr. Corrigan Sr.'s perspective. So blending their vocalization and blending here. Okay. There's one slight complexity to this term focalization, which is that it's not used in the exact same way by everybody. What Gerard Genette had in mind when he coined this term and pointed out this like important phenomenon that was already happening and already used in prose narratives. What he meant by the term focalization was the strategy that the author uses when they decide on what kind of point of view they're going to write their story in. And focalization is the authorial strategy where you plant us inside a particular character's head, and we're stuck with just that person's perceptions, including where they might have some kind of distorted view, including the possibility of unreliability. Unfortunately, other people subsequent to Gerard Genette started using this term in quite a different way, to mean any time where somebody's subjective experience is portrayed on the page. So those two are not identical, and I'm thinking about writing a paper about this actually, where I talk about focalization-G for the Genette point of view, and focalization-B for a later writer, Mika Ball, who started the the popular thing of using focalization in the other sense. Both of those things are like important to be talked about. And it doesn't really do any harm that people are using this term in two different ways, just like it doesn't really do any harm that people use the word theme in two different ways, because you can always tell by context which one is meant. I'm just dropping that in there. Using the term focal character, you are not going to go astray. If you just think in terms of, is this a focal character at this moment? And you're not going to be wrong either way. I'm not asking you to remember Gerard Genet's name or even Mika Ball, far less Mika Ball's name. If you can remember like who sees versus who says, that might be helpful. But the main thing that you need for present purposes is focal and focalization, and understand that point of views can be blended. Okay. If you're just watching this video, if you're just watching this video to get what you need to get to pass the quiz, you can probably shut it off here. But I'm going to go on and say just a few more words about point of view, because it is a particular interest of mine, and because it's so interesting in particularly the comics format. These are slides from a talk that I gave several years ago, and I'm trying to work my way toward a paper that I want to write about it. Here's a Venn diagram of the intersection of various interests of mine. One is narratology, which applies to other things than comics, right? And Gerard Genet had no interest in comics and probably never thought about them. Then there are people who study comics and don't care about narratology either. Then there's this third thing called cognitive science. And there's like a significant overlap of cognitive science with the other two areas of study also. And by the way, the word literature is sometimes used to describe a medium in the same sense that comics is a medium, but at other times it's used to pronounce on like the quality of something. Like not every written book that people buy is considered to rise to the level of literature. And the same goes for comics, right? There are comics that are just schlock, and then there are comics that rise to the level of literary, so literary comics. People who don't know any better, who think that comics is all men in tights or funny animals, think that there is no intersection between comics and literature, but anybody who's taken a class with me knows otherwise. There is an intersection of literary comics. So here's a slide with all of the previous videos you have already watched up to this point from my narrative element series. We don't have to dwell on that. And then narrowing the scope even further within narratology, we get to the point of view. But I would like to claim, let me go back to that previous slide. There is an intersection here also between cognitive science and the study of literature from a narratological perspective, or even not from a narratological perspective, that it means something to say that literature has relevance for people who study how the brain works and how consciousness works and what it means to be a thinking and feeling being. Literature can be thought of as an actual branch of cognitive science because it provides insights into how human brains and human feelings work. Okay. On this slide, there's a list of all the things we already talked about, including the idea that first person versus third person is not necessarily the best place to start. and some examples of two woke filled with a sense of dread kind of sentences that have more in common with each other, even though one is first person and one is third, than either one of them has with this other third person one. That's about enough of that. All right. Here's the reason I wanted to show you these slides at all, is this slide in particular. People have been fiddling around with these ideas about what are the different types of narrative point of view for a long time, at least for half a century, and maybe longer, depending on how you want to cut that pie up. But I don't care that much about whether you master a specific set of terminology or not, other than recognizing the main words that I went through in the previous slide. You're not going to be able to talk to much of anybody at all if you don't understand what they mean by limited versus omniscient. If you don't understand what they mean by objective or dramatic narration or point of view. But getting deeply into the technical terminology that has been used by Gerard Genet or Mika Ball or any of their rivals, I don't think you really need to do that, as long as you understand focal and focalization well enough. It's the concepts I'm interested in. Can you look at where a work of literature, comics or not comics, I don't care, but where it's presenting human experience on the page. And if you can look at that and kind of dissect what's going on from these perspectives, are we getting interior representations of any character, or are we only seeing them from the outside? That's a question you should always ask yourself. The concept of focalization is important there. You should ask yourself whether there is or isn't an overt narrator. And if there is an overt narrator, is it the kind of thing that has a personality? Or is it not? Is it just kind of the disembodied voice of God? Is it like something or somebody which is neutral, which stands outside the story and merely tells the story? Or is the narrator the same person as the protagonist? Which it can be, but only in first person, not in third. Okay. Next question. Is the information that we get like reliable information, the kind you would get straight from God's mouth? Or is that information filtered through some other subjective consciousness, which it can be in either a first person or a third person narration? We can be inside some subjective consciousness. That's not necessarily all or nothing, just as it was not in the example I gave from Jimmy Corrigan. The idea of marriage being a noose. The narrator, the voice on the page, providing us the information about the characters, it was in that one instance kind of colored or influenced by the subjective opinions of the gross dad in the story. So that's a blended narrative point of view, where some of it is the neutral narrator's voice, and then another piece of it is we are getting glimpses into the ugliness of this other person's mind. Okay. And that's it, pretty much. I will put this set of slides up where you can find them if you want to study this closely. That's pretty much all you absolutely need to know at this point. I said more stuff than this when I was at the professional conference. I was able to move faster because I could assume more background knowledge on those people's part. And then this is getting into a discussion of that particular book, which I often suggest as a book club book. Here's a really interesting page. So this is the younger Jimmy Corrigan, the one who's alive in 1980. He goes to meet his father, who he's never met before, because the dude ran out on Jimmy's mother when Jimmy was like less than 2 years old. So they've never met, and they're meeting for the first time when Jimmy is 30 something and his dad is 60-ish, I guess, something like that. And here they are meeting. It's quite interesting, the sort of mirror image effect between the one man and the other man. They look like the same person, but plus 30 years. And this, what we see in the panels here is objective. This is what's really happening in the story world at this moment. And then when we get to this last panel on the page, we suddenly pop into, this is imagination. This is what's going on inside of Jimmy's mind. It's this Freudian scene where he suddenly imagines his father, who he's never met, having sex with his mother. the primal Freudian scene. Okay. And then when you turn the page, the two men are in reality having this kind of polite but strained conversation, as it would be naturally between a man and the father he's never met before in his entire life. And that dialogue continues on the following page within the speech balloons. The speech balloons show you reality, so to speak, because these words are really being said by these two people. But the picture is showing you unreality, Jimmy's imagination. He imagines his father gets done having sex and rolls back off his mother. And then the two men are holding beer mugs in their hands, which in reality they are, because he had him meet him at a bar, at the airport bar where he works. And then Jimmy imagines, what if I took this beer stein and busted it on my father's head and opened him up? And at that point, the dialogue starts to follow the fantasy sequence too. So there's this weird blending of reality and fantasy in these panels. And that's not at all uncommon in comics, that there will be a mismatch between what's in the words track and what's in the pictures track. Sort of more typical, though, is that the pictures will show us reality and the words will show us distortions. Very frequently, a story with a narrator, the narrator will be saying, and then I did such and such, and then such and such happened. And they're telling kind of self-serving lies, and the pictures will show the truth. So that's one way to go. And this sequence kind of interestingly goes the opposite way. We don't need that. We talked about that. The noose. Here's an interesting thing where we learn something about the characters that nobody who's in the story actually knows. These are facts about another main character's parents that she herself doesn't know because she's adopted. The adoptive mom might know some of it, but probably not. The adoption agency might know some of it, but they don't know this. They don't know exactly why and how the sexual relationship that led to the making of this little girl came to an end. I don't want to say anything more. This would be spoilers. Okay, that is enough. We're done with that. Let me just go back to this slide. This is the most important one from my perspective for teaching a relatively introductory class on either comics or in fact other types of narrative. That is enough for now.